Picture this for a moment. You're running through unfamiliar hills, your lungs burning, your armor soaked in blood and sweat. Behind you is a battlefield still echoing with screams. Ahead of you is a fleeing king, the most powerful man in the world, running for his life. This is not a legend. This is not a myth. This is November 5th, 333 BCE, moments after the Battle of Issus, and a 23-year-old king named Alexander of Macedon is closer than anyone in history has ever been to capturing the great king of Persia alive. The unthinkable has already happened. A Persian army has been defeated with its king present. Empires are supposed to fall slowly. This one just cracked in a single afternoon. And as Alexander charges forward, stepping over bodies, crossing ravines made of the dead, the world is quietly crossing a point of no return. At the climax of the battle, Alexander's cavalry slammed into the Persian center like a thunderbolt. Shields splintered, lines collapsed. Darius III, ruler of the largest empire on earth, panicked, turned his chariot and fled. Alexander nearly caught him, nearly ended the Persian Empire in one stroke. As the Macedonians pursued, they crossed a narrow ravine so clogged with corpses, Persians and Greek mercenaries alike, that the dead formed a bridge beneath their feet. Victory at Issus wasn't clean or glorious. It was violent, desperate, and final. And among Alexander's closest companions in that pursuit rode a man history barely remembers today, a loyal general who had held the shattered left flank while Alexander won fame on the right. This victory belonged to him too, because in Alexander's world, glory was shared, but survival was earned in blood. Darius escaped, but it didn't matter. Issus shattered the Persian field army and handed Alexander control over the western half of the empire, including Egypt, the oldest kingdom in the classical world. That single battle didn't just win land, it rewired history. Before Issus, Alexander was a bold invader. After it, he was something else entirely, a man with the power to reshape civilizations. And before this story ends, both Alexander and his closest companions would rule Egypt, not just as kings, but as pharaohs and even as gods. But to understand how a young Macedonian reached this moment, we need to rewind, because this war wasn't supposed to be his war at all. Macedon wasn't Athens, it wasn't Sparta. It was a rough, rural kingdom that many Greeks didn't even consider properly Greek. When Alexander's father, Philip II, tried to compete in the Olympic Games, he had to prove his Greek ancestry first. Politically, Macedon made everyone uncomfortable. Where Athens experimented with democracy and Sparta balanced kings with councils, Macedon was an outright monarchy. Worse, during earlier Persian invasions, Macedon had actually sided with Persia, allowing Persian armies to pass through their land and opportunistically grabbing territory for themselves. And yet, while other Greeks mocked them, Macedon had something far more valuable than philosophy or tradition. Macedon had food, vast farmland, and food builds armies.
Philip II understood that power came from preparation. He transformed Macedon into a military state, building a terrifying new army around tightly drilled infantry formations, the Macedonian phalanx, armed with massive spears, and pairing them with elite cavalry trained for decisive strikes. Then he crushed rival Greek city-states, not just with force, but with marriages, alliances, and intimidation. Eventually, Philip crowned himself leader of a united Greek coalition, the League of Corinth, its stated goal clear: invade Persia. And he prepared his son meticulously. Alexander was trained in warfare, politics, and philosophy, even tutored by Aristotle himself. So when Philip was assassinated under suspicious circumstances, Alexander didn't inherit chaos, he inherited a ready-made war machine. There's a strong argument that Alexander's early victories were really his father's victories, executed by a talented son. All Alexander had to do was not fail, and to his credit, he didn't. But Alexander was not Philip. When Darius offered peace, half the Persian Empire, in exchange for ending the war, Philip might have accepted. Any rational king would have. Alexander refused, because for him, half was never enough. There was something restless in him, something that demanded motion. He conquered a kingdom, then immediately searched for the next horizon. History still struggles to explain it. Ambition, ego, destiny, whatever it was, it drove himself toward the greatest prize of all. When Alexander marched into Egypt, he expected resistance, rebellion, bloodshed. Instead, he was greeted as a liberator. Egypt had endured nearly 2 centuries of Persian rule, and the relationship had been strained. Religious tensions simmered constantly, especially after Persian officials disrespected sacred animals like the Apis bull. Uprisings had followed, so when word arrived that a young king had humbled Darius, Egypt listened. Alexander reinforced that image immediately, honoring Egyptian gods, restoring neglected temples, and making sacrifices in Memphis. He understood something crucial. Empires don't survive on force alone, they survive on belief. Egypt wasn't just ancient, it was powerful. The Great Pyramid was already 2,000 years old. The Nile's floods produced multiple grain harvests a year, feeding populations and armies alike. Egypt was a logistical dream for a conqueror who intended to keep moving. Alexander absorbed Persian administrative systems, kept local officials in place, reformed taxation, and laid plans for a new city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria. It would tie Egypt to Greek trade, Greek culture, and Greek ideas. But Alexander knew that administration alone wouldn't secure Egypt. He needed legitimacy, divine legitimacy. To rule Egypt truly, Alexander had to become something the Persians never were, a pharaoh in the eyes of the gods. That meant traveling to the Oracle of Amun in Siwa, deep in the desert, hundreds of miles from civilization. The journey was dangerous: salt flats, shifting sands, marshes that could swallow caravans whole. A Persian expedition had vanished there years earlier, but Alexander went anyway, supported by naval supply lines along the coast. When his army finally reached the oasis, the desert gave way to green, to life, to temples carved with ancient symbols. And there, inside the sanctuary, Alexander went in alone. No one knows what the oracle said. Alexander never told anyone. But when he emerged, he was declared the son of Amun, Zeus to the Greeks. It fit a story he had heard all his life from his mother Olympias, who insisted he descended from Heracles himself. Whether Alexander truly believed it almost doesn't matter. Politically, it was brilliant. As a divine pharaoh, his rule over Egypt was secure. Grain flowed, money flowed, and with Egypt behind him, Alexander turned east once more, ready to finish what Isis had started. Alexander destroyed Darius, burned Persian capitals, and marched east through Babylon, Central Asia, and into India. He wore trophies of his victories, married into conquered elites, and pushed his army beyond what anyone thought possible. But even gods meet limits. His generals finally refused to go further. Alexander turned back. In Babylon, he fell ill, suddenly, violently. On June 11, 323 BCE, Alexander died at just 32 years old. His body was preserved in honey, sealed in gold, and prepared for a journey home that would never happen. After Alexander's death, his companions carved up the empire. One took Macedon, another took Asia, and one, Alexander's most loyal general, claimed Egypt. But he wanted more than land. He wanted Alexander himself. And so the conqueror's body vanished into history, claimed by the land that had crowned him a god. The empire fractured, but Egypt endured. And in the centuries that followed, a Macedonian dynasty would rule the Nile, blending Greek and Egyptian worlds into something entirely new. This isn't just the story of a battle, it's the story of how one moment, one decision to keep going, changed the shape of the world forever. Here's the part of Alexander's story that often gets lost beneath the titles and triumphs. None of this was easy, and none of it was free. For every city founded, there was another burned. For every god proclaimed, there were thousands buried. Alexander demanded absolute loyalty, not just from conquered peoples, but from the men who had followed him since boyhood. As the years dragged on, the marches grew longer, the enemies stranger, and the victories more hollow. His companions aged, they married, buried friends, and wondered quietly when, if ever, they would go home. Alexander never asked himself that question. Home, to him, was wherever the next horizon waited. And that difference, the growing distance between Alexander's ambition and his army's endurance, would matter far more than any enemy's sword. Somewhere along the way, Alexander stopped being just a man. He dressed differently, spoke differently. He demanded gestures once reserved for gods. To us, it can sound like madness or arrogance, but in the ancient world, the line between human and divine was thin, and Alexander was stepping across it deliberately. He wasn't just conquering territory anymore, he was conquering meaning. Every oracle, every ceremony, every title reinforced the same idea. Alexander was chosen, destined, inevitable. And that belief was powerful. It kept cities from rebelling, it kept armies marching, but it also isolated him. Because once you convince the world you are more than human, you may find yourself terrifyingly alone. In Babylon, at the height of his power, Alexander finally stopped moving. No marches, no sieges, just plans, grand, impossible plans, new cities, a future that stretched endlessly forward. And then, suddenly, nothing. A fever, a weakness, a voice that failed him. The man who could command continents could barely lift his hand. As soldiers filed past his bed, hardened veterans who had crossed deserts and mountains for him, Alexander could only gesture faintly in farewell. No last speech, no final command, just silence. History loves dramatic endings, but Alexander's was quiet, unsettling, and unresolved, exactly the kind that leaves empires trembling. And this is why Alexander still matters, not because he conquered the world, but because he didn't know when to stop. His empire shattered almost immediately, but its consequences did not. Languages blended, gods merged, ideas traveled farther than any army ever could. Egypt became Greek, Greece became something new, and one decision, made on a battlefield at Issus, to keep chasing, to keep pushing, to never settle, sent ripples that still shape our world today. Alexander didn't just change history, he exposed something timeless about ambition itself, that the drive to go further can build civilizations and destroy the people who carry it. And that question, how far is too far, is one we're still asking.